Hello, and welcome to Regrets I've Had a Few. I'm Paul Hunter, Artistic Director of Told by an Idiot, and this is a podcast where I talk to friends and colleagues delving into what made them the person they are today. Hello, and welcome. My guest this month is a director, theatre maker and performer who has been at the forefront of alternative British theatre for over 3 decades, a founder member of Complicité and a dynamic and respected figure in the world of opera. Her playful sense of mischief shines as bright as ever. Welcome, Annabel Arden.
Hello, Paul. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, it's so lovely to have you as a guest on the podcast. And I have to say, you and I spent a week in a room together a few weeks ago, and I was sharing it with our dear friend and colleague, Hayley Carmichael, yesterday. And I said, I can't believe I've never played with Annabel. I've seen her so brilliantly over the years, connected and friends. But I found it such a joy, both improvising, messing about with it, and seeing you improvise and mess about. So I had to get that out of the way first. We're going to touch on performing, I'm sure, in lots of ways now. But I always start in the same way by taking my guests back to the beginning of their experience of performance. And I just wonder if you can recall what maybe the very early thing you saw was. Was that at school or with parents? Or
Well, I was very lucky because it wasn't so much school, although I think there was probably quite a lot of stuff at school. My father was an unusual man. He was a scientist. His field was eyes, vision. And I remember very strongly he took me to see A Flea in Her Ear at the Old Vic, which had Geraldine McEwen in it.
Wow.
And it was directed by a very famous French director called Jacques Charon. And I had the great pleasure of working with Geraldine years later. I did a wonderful radio play with her. But when I was a kid, I can't have been very old. I suppose I must have been about 7. I just completely fell in love with her. I couldn't believe the elegance and the comedy and the vivacity. And I was so taken with it, and it was hilarious. And A Flea in Her Ear there's a very important character at the centre of it called Chandebise, who doubles as the porter in the brothel. Chandebise is a bourgeois, and the actor has to double as the porter in the brothel. This is the whole joke. And I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe it. So my father took me to the stage door and said, we have to see Robert Lang, who played those 2 characters. And the stage door very kindly rang him up and he let us into his dressing room. And I said, I don't believe you played those 2 characters. And he showed me his costumes, which had his name, of course, sewn into the neck on both costumes. And one said Posh and the other said Chandebise. And I think that was the moment where I went, this is it. This is the stuff. This is what we've got to do.
What an amazing thing to go and see. And also how brilliant that your dad went, come on, we'll go to the stage door.
Yeah, I know.
See. Was that kind of it what Dad did? Would he just say, okay, we're going to...
He was a very unusual man. I think he really did kind of want to be an actor. And he was a very brilliant scientist. I mean, he actually discovered things about how we see vision. But he was a very odd man. I think we'd say he was on the spectrum in some way. And there was a very funny incident where much later, I was playing in the Street of Crocodiles at the National Theatre. And we had the wonderful César Sarachu taking the leading role of Joseph. And César was in some ways delicate. He was a delicate person. And we had no understudies, okay? So he had a pain in his heel. It's terrible, Simon. It's terrible. I cannot. And he got through the matinee, but then there was the evening performance. And I said, I know what, I'll call my dad. And I said, Dad, you've got to come to the National Theatre and you've got to be the doctor. And he said, right. And he came zooming in a kind of Sherlock Holmes tweed coat and a kind of little Tyrolean hat with a feather in it. This was the costume he decided to do, with a little bag. And the stage manager brought him into Cesar's dressing room and he said, Nurse, thank you. Now, could you help me to remove the patient's trousers? And he kind of did this show, which was completely insane. And he insisted that the props department make a little prop for the heel of Cesar's shoe that he wore in the show. And Cesar was completely cured by this.
That is absolutely priceless and so brilliantly conjured up. Because in many ways, that feels like Fado anyway. The idea of what your first story was. That is amazing. Oh, that's so funny. Um, was there any show business or theatre in your family background anywhere? Do you aware of?
Absolutely not. No, my mum was a wonderful homemaker, and she did all sorts of small jobs and things, secretaries and this and that. And my dad was a scientist. No theatre anywhere.
Wow. So this is interesting. This now, you obviously you're at school and you've seen the Fado and you've been persuaded by the man who played both parts. Was there drama to do at school, or how did it start to develop as something you became passionate about?
Yeah, there was drama at school. I mean, I was, again, pretty lucky. We were allowed to do a lot on our own. We were encouraged to sort of make stuff up, really, I think. And I think the earliest thing I can recall doing was I did a dramatization of Lewis Carroll's poem, The Walrus and the Carpenter. And I made oyster costumes for everybody. And that was fun. I was little. That was primary school. And then in my secondary school, we had something called the Shakespeare competition. And you could, with your classmates, take a scene, any scene. And you could devise it how you liked. And I used to love doing that. I did quite a lot of them.
Both of those memories make me a sense of an early directorial voice seems to be emerging with the costumes on the Lewis Carroll and so you enjoyed both the playing and the kind of creation at the same time?
I think I must have done. Yeah, I think I must have done. I think I was always I never really had enough confidence to think of myself as an actress. I mean, I loved it. I loved performing, but I somehow felt that I was wrong. You know, I looked wrong. I wasn't pretty in the right way. And I don't know. And I suppose I was a bit of a bossy boots, really. And I like telling people what to do.
So you go through school, you go to university, that's right? And you're continuing to do drama at university, I assume?
Very much so. Very much so. First thing I mean, again, I did do quite a lot of acting. I acted with a group called the Cambridge Mummers. And actually I had the great privilege of playing, I think probably for the first time in about 400 years, the character of Moll Cutpurse in a Jacobean comedy called The Roaring Girl by Middleton and Decker, which was directed by my friend Bridget Larmore, and we took it to the Edinburgh Fringe. So I played Moll Cutpurse, which was great because she was a female highwayman.
What?
And she really existed. She was a real person. So that was good. Gosh, as I talk about this, I think, bloody hell, I better get back on that stage because it was such a lot of fun. And I played all sorts of things. And then I'm directed too. I co-directed again with Bridget. We did Travesties with Emma Thompson.
Wow.
Oh my God. Because we were early mates. I gave Tilda Swinton her first job.
Wow, what was that?
It was in a very odd Polish play called Princess Iwona by Witold Gombrowicz.
Wow.
So we did loads of stuff, you know, and then, of course, the important meeting, or one of the very important meetings at Cambridge, was I met Simon McBurney. And
I was curious. I wasn't sure, actually, historically where you met. I didn't know whether you met in Paris, but you met at university. So tell me about that first meeting. I'm intrigued.
Well, we were in a play together by Ben Jonson. And it's slightly posh, Cambridge, you see, we do these obscure plays. Ben Jonson, and it was called Sejanus, His Fall.
Yes, I'm familiar with it.
Oh, are you? My God.
Well, I rather stupidly chose a speech from it at a drama school audition. And I did two things. I didn't understand what I was saying. And I found the play impenetrable. And surprise, surprise, I didn't get a place in that particular drama school. Anyway, carry on with your production. I'm sure was much finer than my interpretation.
I really don't think so. Simon and I bonded because we couldn't understand what was going on. And they'd hired a whole set of costumes, I think, from somewhere like the RSC. So we had these fantastic period costumes. And it was total nonsense. So he and I used to have a laugh. And he was really a punk at that stage, and he rode a motorbike, and he used to take me roaring around Cambridge at the most fantastic speed. It was always a thrill being with Simon because he was a big risk taker. I mean, even then, you know. But we became very interested in talking about theatre and thinking about what we would do because we saw everybody, you know, kind of lining up careers. We were a particular generation. I mean, there was Emma Thompson, there was Hugh Laurie, there was Stephen Fry, there was Tilda Swinton. And, you know, they kind of got agents and did footlights and did the thing you were supposed to do. Kate Duchenne. So, you know, people were going into proper theatre. And Simon and I looked at each other and went, you don't want to do that. And then, luckily, there was a very interesting woman called Pip Broughton.
Yes.
And Pip told us about Lecoq. And Simon went to Lecoq in Paris. And I went to visit him because he was a year older than me. And I had great fun with him in Paris in his tiny little chambre de bonne up, 8 flights of spiral staircase. And you couldn't really visit the school. It wasn't allowed. But of course, the risk taker, McBurney, devised a scheme. And he smuggled me in to the big hall where they did all the work. And he hid me behind a kind of, I mean, either I'm misremembering this or it really happened. I just kind of don't know anymore. I think I was hidden behind a kind of great stack of gym mats. And he said, now look, you can't come out. You can't pee, you can't do anything. Because if Jack sees you, I'm out. So I hid and I watched. And then, I mean, from that whole, it was fascinating. And I decided not to do the whole 3 years of Lecoq. I went instead to work with Monica Pagneux and Philippe Gaulier, who had been major teachers at Lecoq and then started their own studio. So I worked with them and I did something at Lecoq, which was called the LEM, the Laboratoire Études de Mouvement, which was fascinating, run by Lecoq and also his architect associate. So it was about space, really.
Wow. And so you're with Philippe and Monica at the same time that Simon is at Lecoq?
No, I went later. I think he'd finished. Oh, we had maybe a tiny overlap. Golly, it's terrible, isn't it? Can't remember what year anything happened. But yeah, no, we had a sort of a little bit of an overlap. But by that time, he was doing all sorts of things. He was in the Comedy Store and he was doing this and that and goodness knows what. And then I went later. I went later because what happened immediately after Cambridge was that I teamed up with another group of friends which included Neil Bartlett and various friends from Oxford and friends from all over the world, actually, international group of people. We called ourselves the 1982 Theatre Company, a socialist feminist collective. Takes you back, doesn't it? And we were 8 and we decided to work very hard for a year and save as much money as possible and then to work on theatre for 1982. And we organised, all of us did all the administration and everything. We organised a small-scale tour and we went to Latvia because one of us was Latvian. We went to Canada because there's a big Latvian community in Canada. This was Banuto Rubes, very fine director now. And we made some pretty extraordinary work, I have to say. And then Simon rang me in 1983 and said, you know how to put together a tour, don't you? Do you want to, we sort of make something? So I said, yeah, all right. So we went and lived in his mother's house and we worked in a scout hall. And he brought us some people over from Lecoq and we put together a small-scale tour.
And this was Put It On Your Head?
It was Put It On Your Head.
Yeah. With Fiona and Marcello? Or?
Fiona and Marcello and me and Simon. Yeah.
And what's your memory of that very first show?
Well, it was kind of extraordinary. I mean, I played a minor role. I couldn't play at the speed and the physical sort of finesse of those three. But I suppose I was partly an outside eye. I was always the person looking and saying, yeah, that's good. And partly I was playing and I found it very difficult. I mean, the improvisational quality of it was right close to the edge. And Simon had a marvellous way of saying, you know what? I think tonight, when we get to the bit where you fold the deck chair, I don't think you should. I think what you should do is pass it to me, and then I'm going to give it to Fiona, and you can go, oh, okay.
Wow.
So it was great fun. It was an extraordinary time. But I also found it hard, you know.
Yeah, it's funny at the beginning of something, isn't it? A first show. You know, we obviously told by we're 10 years younger than you guys, and I've talked about this many times, and also with obviously on this podcast with previous Complicité alumni like, you know, Joss and Catherine and whatever. But I that very first show when we turned 30, we were reflecting on stuff, and we went into a room just to mess about with some things from way back. But it's such a mix of things that first time when you, because for us, we didn't want to make a company. We just wanted to make a show that was ours. People say, oh, how did you make a company? We didn't. We just, like you, we got some people together. We got a bit of money. Brilliantly, we had John Wright in our case, who knew what he was doing. And then we got to Edinburgh. And I remember saying to Hayley, whatever happens, if this is absolutely terrible, nobody's ever done this show before. It's not Shakespeare. It's not Molière. Wonderful those things are. We've made this up. And there's something about making it up, isn't there? The beginning when you go, we did this.
Yes. No, it's wonderful. And I mean, that's how Marcello begins. One of the great beginning lines of A Minute Too Late, which was our second show. He said, it's something we made up ourselves.
Yeah.
And I must say, there was nothing quite like it, those early shows. It was a huge thrill.
And also, I think I have to say, for someone who came slightly after you, the impact, which I tried to communicate sometimes to younger performers who maybe have come to Complicité later on. And I talk about the very early days. And I've said this before. I remember John Wright saying to a group of us, in which Hayley and I we were at college 1986, so 3 years later, he said, we're all going to the Shaw Theatre tonight. Come on, we're all going. We're going to see an evening with Theatre de Complicité. I didn't even know what Complicité was. Luckily, Hayley spoke French, so she translated. And then we all sat in that theatre and watched this extraordinary anarchy unfold. And I think for us as young, you know, being influenced by John, who'd studied with Philippe and blah, 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 and doing Commedia, I think it wasn't just the work. It was you guys. It was the bunch of you lot that we hadn't seen before. It felt like some mad circus. Or it wasn't like theatre. And I think people sometimes forget where you were landing in the bigger culture of theatre. There wasn't anything like that.
No. I mean, I think it's extremely... Well, there was a thing which I saw, I don't know if you ever saw, earlier, actually, which was called Le Grand Magique Circus by Jérôme Savary, which came to the Roundhouse, brought by the great Thelma Holt. And we were influenced by that. Now, Celia Gore-Booth was in that. And there were other European things which came, which were highly influential on us. So there was Cantor.
Yeah.
There was Comediants. That all came to the Riverside Studios. And there was something about those people on stage where they weren't like actors in a play.
Yeah.
Something else was going on. And you didn't know whether it was their real relationships in real life, or it wasn't quite clear what kind of human bonding you were seeing. And we were really influenced by that. And also Philippe used to say that, well, that's why we called ourselves Complicity, because Philippe said, if there's no complicity between the actors on stage and there's no complicity between the actors and the audience, there is no theatre.
Yeah.
In other words, it's happening for real. And I think that's why, you know, people do love stand-up, and there's been more and more and more and more and more stand-up as we've got older. And I think people crave that sense of, I'm really having a relationship with you.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And audiences are hungry for that. And we have different ways of describing it, different terms, whether something feels authentic or whatever these things are. Audiences absolutely crave it. It's interesting you mentioned Cantor, and I of course, it inevitably takes me to Street of Crocodiles. You mentioned that that's our story. And also, I suppose it was the first time when, I suppose, properly Told by Lydia and Complicité felt they connected, of course, because Hayley was in that show. And I remember it was very Hayley, because, as you know, she's so particular to who she is. But I remember at the time, she'd done a David Glass show called Gormenghast, and she was wonderful in it. And Simon saw that, and then I think, or you or Simon, whatever, invited her to join some workshops. And we were amazed because it was a big deal that one of us was going to be with you lot, you know. And then Hayley kept saying, "Oh, it's not an audition. I'm just joining for a couple of weeks to mess about, you know." And as the 2 weeks went on, I said, "Are you sure they're not looking for a show?" Now, "Oh no, it's nothing to do with the show. I'm just joining in for a bit." And and then eventually she said, "Simon's asked me to be in the show," and we all laughed and went, "We told you that." She absolutely had just gone in very innocently, going, "Oh, okay, I'll play around. I'll be part of this."
Yeah.
There's a moment, knowing her very well. Do you remember the documentary that was made about that show? Do you remember?
Yes, yes.
And I remember watching it, BBC documentary, whatever it was. And there's a moment, and of course the camera stayed on this because they saw it. It's a moment where Simon is talking to Hayley. Because I know Hayley since I was 17, I thought she's going to cry. Any minute now, she's going to cry. And I wasn't sure that Simon was aware of that. Why would he be, you know? But as a watcher who knew, and of course she did. And of course the camera stayed with this dynamic for a moment because it was so typically Hayley. It was right there, right? Like it is, you know.
Well, she's such a wonderful performer because, you know, she is just all there. It's so available all the time.
But also I kind of feel, having devoured and all of your early shows and loved so much about them, particularly the physical comedy and all of that, it was kind of extraordinary. I remember being, I think, the very first preview at the Cottesloe when Simon came out, and of course you were all delayed and all this sort of stuff. But it was such an extraordinary moment in theatre for me to see something like that, where you kind of thought, wow. But I'm assuming things like Cantor were a big reference for you all when you were working on something like that.
Well, I mean, I think it was there in our hinterland. I don't think we actually brought it to the fore ever. Although, of course, we had to acknowledge that the scene with the desks and the children was influenced by the Dead class, very much. But then we had to do the children because Bruno Schutz was a teacher, and it was an important part of his life. So it wasn't like we thought, oh, let's do that Cantor bit. And of course, Cantor was Polish, and Bruno Schulz is a great Polish artist. No, Crocodiles was incredible. I mean, it was a very high point of my life, really, I think.
No, I'm sure. And you taught it everywhere, and it was an extraordinary, you know, I think a very influential piece for lots of audiences and theatre makers, of course. We touched on, obviously, your meeting with Simon and what that was, but I'd like to talk a little bit about your late husband, Stephen Jeffries, and I think an astonishing playwright. I had the privilege of being in one of his plays, playing a very small part, which I might touch on, called The Clink, 1990, which was amazing. But can you talk a little bit about when you first, because in some ways, from the outside, you wouldn't seem, I'm talking more to theatre now, but you seem from very different disciplines in a sense. So how did you meet? Where was the meeting?
Well, it's a funny story. We actually met first 15 years before we got together. Mm-hmm. So we got together in 1997. So we met in the early 80s. And we were set up by Celia Gore-Booth, the great late Celia Gore-Booth, who said, "I know just the man for you. This is the man." And she made us meet in the bar at the ICA. And at the time, he was going out with somebody else, and I just didn't get it. So that was funny. And then we almost met again at an awards ceremony. And then we met at a party in 1997 by accident, because by that time I decided that I probably better have a relationship and possibly some children. So I was quite deliberately hunting. And he didn't stand a chance, poor man. I'd gone to this party, which was in Harlesden, a place I never would go. And he was there, and we ended up talking. And then suddenly that thing happened where nobody was in the room. Everybody had gone except us, and we hadn't noticed at all. And I sort of suddenly realised I'd fallen in love with him. So I drove him home, which was very sort of weird and embarrassing because I wasn't a very good driver, and he couldn't drive either. And I dropped him in Crouch End, where he was staying with his sister. And then I couldn't find my way home to Stoke Newington because I was so befuddled. And I ended up driving halfway to Cambridge on the M11. So then I somehow got home and thought, oh my God, this is it. And luckily, he felt the same way.
Oh, that's a brilliant story. That the kind of captive or intoxication of it means you were almost halfway to Cambridge rather than Stoke Newington. That's why I've been titled for a book, Halfway to Cambridge. It's quite a good. You know, I was reading more about him in preparation for this, really, and I think the fact that he managed to combine, as I've said to you, I mean, it's partly something that's very close to me, the sense of his comedy I loved, and particularly his ability to write fantastically funny lines, but then also to be able to really delve in a really interesting way into the human condition, but also be political, also be able to find kind of metaphor and political metaphors that reach out across a bigger kind of landscape. What's it like to live with a writer like that? Did he have a way of working? Did he have an office, or how did he work?
He did have a studio, which was out of the house. He had to leave the house to work, really. But he was. He actually did say to me, he said, "You know, you are lucky because I am sane," implying that many writers were not. And he did work, and he was very disciplined about working. He often worked very early in the morning. He was a wonderful father, and I never felt ever that our family life was anything other than quite simply sublime, fantastic. He wasn't absent. He was an exceptionally generous person, I think. He was a very generous teacher, but he was a generous person in the family, and he had lots of friends. And he was a wonderful guitarist, you know. And he used to play and sing every night after dinner. And the kids grew up with such a lot of music.
Wow. What was that? Of course. What was the blues play he wrote?
I just stopped by to see the man. Oh, yeah. Well, he could play all that stuff, you know. And he had lots of friends, music friends, and they would come to the house and we'd have a lot of jamming. There was always music, always music. So he was... he didn't have one rhythm, you know. Things changed. There'd be long periods of writing a play where he wouldn't actually write any dialogue at all. He would just be mapping it and preparing it. Then the last phase was very intense. We wouldn't see him, you know, when he was actually writing the dialogue. He worked incredibly hard, and yet he was always there, present. He wasn't really lost in his head. I mean, there were times when I thought, oh, well, yeah, you're not really here. You're in the 18th century or wherever you are. And I was never allowed. The one rule was you could never ask how it was going. That was not allowed. You couldn't say, had a good day. How's it going? That was completely verboten.
Would he be okay with questions that were more specific about the play, or was it just nothing about it at all?
He preferred not to be questioned. And bit by bit, you know, as we grew together, you know, he would talk a bit about it, but he was very private about the writing.
Yeah.
I was allowed to be the first reader.
Yeah.
But when he was actually working, he really didn't want to talk about it.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, we've touched a lot on this, and the thing that we share a lot is of a collaborative form of writing that, you know, that we grew up with, and you and Simon and me and Hayden were that kind of and people sometimes say to me, "Oh, would you like to write a play?" And I said, "Well, I have written plays. They just happen to be collaboratively." But the act of going to a place like Stephen did and creating that thing where you sit in front of, almost like we're sitting at now, that feels such a personal thing to do. So I can kind of understand why sometimes you might go, actually, I don't want to discuss this. This is something that is still emerging between me and my imagination, or whatever, you know.
Absolutely. Now, I mean, he used to, you know, I remember him saying to somebody, it might even be in the book, you know, we published posthumously this wonderful book called Playwriting. People would ask him, what is it like to write a play? And he was quite fond of quoting the composer Harrison Birtwistle, who, when asked what's it like to compose music, he said, it's like knitting. So Stephen would sometimes say that, or he'd say, you sit in front of a screen until your forehead bleeds.
Oh my gosh.
In other words, don't ask.
No, exactly. You do not. Just because of Mr. Burt was just come on. I want to talk a bit about opera, because obviously you do a lot of opera and you've done some extraordinary operas. And how did that movement into opera come about? Or is that something that's always been in your background?
Well, I was lucky enough to be taken to the opera a lot by my parents, who are great opera fans. But I never thought I'd do it. They just took us along, and we enjoyed it very much. It was very relaxed affair. We in those days at ENO, you could buy the box, which is over the timpani, at a reduced price because your stage view is obstructed as well. You don't get the whole stage. So my parents used to get this box, and if we got bored, we were allowed to lie under a blanket at the back with a torch and a book and a sandwich. Well, of course, it was huge fun. So that was there. But then it happened because Christine Chibnall, who ran and still runs, or sort of runs, Opera North, came to see my production of The Winter's Tale at the Derek Hammersmith, a Complicity production of The Winter's Tale. And she said, "Would you like to direct The Magic Flute?" And I thought, golly, okay. I mean, you can't really say no, So that was how it happened. It just happened. And I had a very wonderful home in Opera North. In fact, I've been working there for 30 years. I'm just going to go back this winter. I'm going back to direct Wagner's Flying Dutchman.
30 years? Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. And it's interesting, isn't it? Like, I suppose when I'm not in any, I've never directed or I've been in one opera, but not singing. It feels when I see it, and my father-in-law was a huge opera fan, so he took us to see operas, and I really enjoyed them. Particularly enjoyed Rigoletto. I really like Rigoletto. I think the story really appeals to me as well. I really love the story. It's brilliant.
Great story.
But also, I suppose, I'm saying something that obviously but the sense that it feels innately theatrical somehow. There's something about the theatre of it that it's in its very essence. It is.
Absolutely. Well, there's because it's so heightened, because singing is a heightened form of speech, and you only sing. You can't. I mean, I have a particular hatred of some modern libretti which try to explore the banal, which is something I really think is difficult to explore in music. So when you have people saying, "Pass me the carrot," you kind of go, "No, I don't think that's so great." And it's not banal, it's heightened, it's very heightened in all sorts of different ways. You do have conversation in the form of recitativo in all of the 19th century, or sometimes you have spoken word as well. I mean, Carmen is full of spoken word, as is the Magic Flute. But it's a heightened world, and it's deliberately heightened because the function, I think, of opera is to try and take you to extremes of human experience. And you kind of have to really laugh or cry or be very taken out of yourself and moved. And it's an extreme form.
Well, long may you continue exploring it. Annabel, thank you so much as we reach the end of this wonderful chat. I always finish in the same way, where I ask my guests some rapid fire questions and you just respond with the first answer. Here we go. Margaret Rutherford or Joyce Grenfell?
Margaret Rutherford.
A Matter of Life and Death or Black Narcissus?
Oh, both, please.
Yes, both. Jeanette Winterson or Angela Carter?
Angela Carter.
Paris or New York?
Paris.
Improvisation or text?
No, you've got to have both.
Either a walk in the woods or a walk on the cliffs?
Connie. I think the woods, actually.
Okay. Don Giovanni or Cosi fan tutte?
Oh my God, neither of those would I ever really want to direct, but I'll go with the Don.
I won't. It'll open up a whole other half hour if I go into why you don't want to direct either of those. Annabel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Paul. It's been fun.
Dear listeners, if you've enjoyed this idiot podcast, please spread the word